What's going on, San Antonio Spurs fans? Welcome back to another edition of Pounding the Rock Spurs Talk. Today, I've got a very special guest. I've got associate editor of Grizzly Bear Blues, Parker Fleming. How are you doing today, Parker?
Doing pretty good, making it. Just ready for some Grizzlies and Spurs basketball. I'm really excited because it's just like kind of this new chapter of this Grizzly Spurs rivalry. I remember the Spurs were the Grizzlies' first ever playoff opponents. It was a sweep, but what do you expect when you're going up against prime Tim Duncan? You had the 2011 series with the Grizzlies upset, and then this Gregg Popovich just kind of set out a mission to humiliate the Grizzlies in the playoffs whenever they get. They had the 2017 series where you had Kawhi Leonard turn into like a modern day Jordan, and then Mike Conley rose up to the challenge and really broke out. So, but this is different. There's no Tim Duncan, there's no Tony Parker, no Ginobili, no Kawhi, but on the Grizzlies side, there's no member of the core four anymore. It's just all fresh and a fresh concept too with the NBA playing. So I'm really excited about tomorrow.
Yeah, I'm excited about it tomorrow too. And I guess before we really get into things, did you feel like the Grizzlies performed better or worse than you expected them to this season? And what were some of the major contributing factors into how they finished the season this year?
No, for sure. I thought they performed better than I expected. I honestly anticipated them being more close to y'all's spot, like around 10th, maybe 11th. For one, you could probably agree with me on this one. I had New Orleans overachieving a little bit more than they did. I thought the Bledsoe and Adams acquisitions were really going to pay off, and the Stan Van Gundy hiring was really going to pay off, and it just flopped. So that kind of helped, but a lot of people readjusted their expectations in the middle of the season, which kind of led to people being outraged over every little loss. And it was like the sky's falling. And it was so exhausting. I did not want to be on Twitter for that, but I still kind of stayed the course. So they performed better than they should have. I think Vegas had them at 30.5 wins, and they exceeded that by about 7. So that's a win. That's a win for sure. And you're doing all that too with Jaren Jackson Jr. only playing 10 games. And even then, those 10 games, he's just getting into the flow of the game and returning from a 9-month injury. So I had them better than expected. I also remember too, after Ja Morant went down, all of us went to Tankathon. We all talked about whether they want Cade Cunningham or Jalen Green. And they just kept chugging along. And I think the biggest contributing factors to that is I wrote about it on Grizzly Bear Blues, is just the confidence that Taylor Jenkins put into his guys to just have the green light to take whatever shot they want, whether it's Jonas Valanciunas post-ups or floaters from Brandon Clark, Xavier Tillman, and Tyus Jones, or mid-range jumpers from Dillon Brooks and Kyle Anderson, or threes from Grayson Allen, Desmond Bane, and D'Anthony Melton. So you had the next man up mentality really just resonate with this team. I wish I could pull up the stats, but just with this team and how deep it is and how well GM Zach Kleiman has built this team, there are a lot of good players that just end up getting the DNP CDs. But whenever they're back in the rotation, they respond so well. We saw it with Grayson Allen, D'Anthony Melton, Xavier Tillman. It was awesome to see. They're also winning games with guys like John Conchar and Killian Tilly getting rotation minutes. So I just think it was an overall team effort that just really is because of the culture and system that Taylor Jenkins is building in Memphis.
Yeah, and I love Taylor Jenkins, what he's done for the Grizzlies. He was a Austin Spurs alum in terms of being on that staff. And I love that they've drafted so well. I feel like they've really drafted well. They've got really quality guys. They got a guy like Desmond Bane kind of later in the first round. They got a guy like Brandon Clark later in the first round. And I personally was really high on Killian Tilly. I had him right outside the lottery in my big board last year. And he didn't really get to play that much, but I like the addition. I like the addition of Jontay Porter. I think they've done a fantastic job of adding talent around Ja Morant. I think this is going to be a special team in a few years, but let's kind of talk about right now. So you mentioned you were excited for this play-in. Are you happy with this play-in format? And do you think it's something that the NBA should keep around? I know a lot of Spurs fans are happy just because it gives the Spurs the chance to get into the playoffs.
Well, before I answer that question, I do want to let you know you brought up Brandon Clark and them drafting him in the late first round. I remember being at our at our draft watch party, like pre-COVID, everything. And all of our friends, we were looking at Twitter and we were like, crap, Brandon Clark's falling. He may go to us, but oh, shoot, he may go to the Spurs. And they passed on him for a guy that hasn't really made any sort of noise in his first 2 seasons. And we all rejoiced in the bar. We actually, a group of like 4 of us took fireball shots because they got Brandon Clark with the 21st pick that they acquired in the Mike Conley trade. But to get into the play, and I'm happy with it. And if they reverted back to the traditional playoffs, it wouldn't really bother me. I know a beat writer out of Memphis for the Daily Memphian, Chris Harrington, pointed out that games like the Golden State Warriors and Memphis Grizzlies game on Sunday, it lost meaning because in an actual situation, in the traditional sense, that's the do or die game. They were tied for 8, and that would have had so many high stakes. I think it probably would have been the biggest regular season game in franchise history. And then also, too, on the Eastern Conference side, you had that with Charlotte and Washington, too. So if they went back to traditional, wouldn't bother me. But with this one, I really enjoyed it because it just added more meaning to the season. And I don't know about you, but I'm just not a fan of watching teams just completely fabricate their injury report to help their lottery odds by the time it's like a month out from the season ending. And with this new format, you had teams like Sacramento who weren't technically mathematically eliminated until the end of last week. Or you have teams like Toronto still fighting for a shot at the playoffs within the last 2 weeks. Granted, I understand that 1 to 2 week mark before the season ends, I understand that teams are going to try to make sure nobody gets hurt and they're going to preserve draft odds. But for the nature of competition, I know some people will point it to the participation trophy culture. I don't see it as that. I just see it as a competitive culture because then you have teams, you have almost half the league fighting for playoff spots and the other half, or like more of like 2/3 of it's fighting for playoff spots and the other third is fighting for lottery odds. And that's just not fun for competitive balance. So I enjoyed it, and it allowed for teams like Memphis and San Antonio, who are ravaged by COVID in that first half. It allowed them to still have a shot at things because not even just the fact of missing games and such and having to have that compact schedule, but you also have it to where like you're not suffering from it. In a traditional way, both Memphis and San Antonio were in the playoff picture before they got hit with the COVID stuff. And in a traditional playoffs, they would have been out of it probably because of that. So I like it. Wouldn't bother me if they went traditional, but I think this is really fresh and kind of just adds intrigue to the competitive balance as such.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with you there. It's nice to see teams that normally would be maybe tanking at the end of the season to improve their lottery odds instead fighting for a playoff spot. It made it more competitive. And most of all, like I said, it gave the Spurs a chance to kind of push for the postseason. And at the beginning of the season, I was one of the people who said, well, if they kind of go young, they move away from LaMarcus, DeMar, Rudy, Patty, all those guys. And they just, they don't necessarily phone it in, but they give the reins to the young guys and they make the lottery. No big deal. But once it was clear they weren't going to do that, it was nice knowing that they still had a chance to get into this postseason. And, they're like, I think, finished the season 6 games under 500, which isn't good, but it's nice to see this because if they do get into the playoffs, which is not something I really expect them to do, these are really huge games for the members of their young core. Even if they don't have a guy like Ja Morant or Jaren Jackson, it's really going to be beneficial for, a DeJounte Murray, Alani Walker, Keldon Johnson, those guys. So I'm excited for it. I'd be fine if the NBA kept it around too. So let's go ahead and just hop into the game preview. What kind of rotations are you expecting out of Taylor Jenkins now that most of the roster is healthy? And what are some of your keys to victory for Memphis?
That's tough because the rotations has just been a constant just randomness ever since they've gotten Jaren Jackson Jr. back and healthy. And even then they're also trying to integrate Justice Winslow into the rotation as well. It just didn't work. And I think this is kind of like the big product of that is just he didn't have a normal offseason condition. He had to rehab the entire time. And then there's no practice time. There's no time for rest in this condensed schedule. I know y'all are dealing with that as well. There's no time for any of that. So he never really got into a flow. You have people debating over how they should be playing Xavier Tillman over Brandon Clark. But Brandon Clark's even said in media stuff, like he said, I've been dealing with nagging injuries. And I think, again, the whole rest and stuff. If I do expect rotation stuff, obviously starting five, Ja Morant, Dylan Brooks, Kyle Anderson, Jaren Jackson Jr., Jonas Valanciunas. That's pretty easy. The bench is going to get interesting. You can Sharpie in DeAnthony Melton and Desmond Bane for sure. They'll get spot minutes from Tyus Jones. The Brandon Clark will also be in that rotation. But I mean, if they went Xavier Tillman, I wouldn't be surprised either. But I think Brandon Clark is just higher on the pecking order in the organization and Coach Jenkins' mind. And I don't think people are really recognizing that either. And also, too, I know y'all, I don't know where you fall on this, but when a player has evidence that he's a good player, don't consider a slump that he sucks somehow. Like, and that's kind of where we are with Brandon Clark. But I think you would get some spot minutes for Xavier Tillman as well, because Jaren Jackson Jr., he still gets in foul trouble. And, you know, that was a problem pre-injury, but also I think he's still in that adjustment period of just getting back into game speed. And you can see, I think Tillman played like 4 minutes the other night against Golden State. I can see some scenario where he gets just very small spot minutes. But I would kind of expect the rotation to be like that. And I think the biggest key to victory, obviously you could say it's like Ja Morant, and that's very true. Having him play like the top 5 point guard he said he was on TNT a couple weeks ago, that's pretty nice too. But I think it's going to come down to the bench, because the other day against Golden State, everything kind of fell apart because the Grizzlies bench was on the other end of an avalanche. They allowed Jordan Poole and Andrew Wiggins to just unload on them. And I think if the Grizzlies do not win that bench battle against a very good bench, by the way, then it could spell trouble for Memphis.
Yeah, I think the bench is going to be really huge, because I don't think there's like a giant difference between the starting units here. I think the bench is really going to make the difference. But where I'm worried for the Spurs here is that their bench just hasn't played that well since, Derek White went down. It's forced other guys into the starting lineup like Lonnie Walker, and now their bench, and Pop has really gone with a 9-man rotation. So the bench has looked like Patty Mills, Devin Vassell, Rudy Gay, and either Drew Eubanks or Gorgui Dieng, depending on how Pop is feeling. And they really haven't played that well together. Devin Vassell, he came back from COVID. He's pretty much played one complete 180 from how he was playing at the beginning of the season. He's not knocking shots down. He looks a step slower on defense. COVID affects people in different ways. Rudy Gay has been fine. Patty is shooting 33% over the last 2 months, and he's still getting the same exact amount of minutes. And, Gorgui Dieng is fine, and Drew Eubanks are fine, but that's about it. I don't really think they're a plus off the bench. So I'm worried for the Spurs in that aspect, that the Grizzlies have more depth. But we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. I wanted to ask you this as well. So I know I asked you about the rotation, but does Taylor Jenkins do like a 9-man rotation, a 10-man rotation, or does it just depend on the game? Because I know for Pop, it's a 9-man rotation pretty much every single night, unless it's a blowout.
So Taylor Jenkins has been adamant about 10 all season long. He's always said he's going to go 10. There's been some nights, depending on just game flow, mainly foul trouble, he's gone 11. And in those situations, he's been rolling with John Conchar. And so, but last season, oh my gosh, it drives me crazy, because last season they were playing 11-man rotations. And in those rotations, they were playing Solomon Hill and Marco Guduric, who is just a 1-year rookie. He's not even in the league right now. And now this year, you have guys like Xavier Tillman and Grayson Allen. Well, Grayson Allen was starting a lot, but when he came back from injury, he was a rotation casualty at some point. At some point, they're giving DNP CDs to Tyus Jones. And now Justice Winslow is out of the rotation. Granted, he doesn't look like a rotation player right now, but still, you had this like deep roster. Now it's like, okay, 10. I'm like, you just went 11 with a significantly less team. But he goes 10. I could see it shifting down to 9 or so, especially in the playoffs. It just gets so tricky because they're going to play Ja Morant 40 minutes a night. And so they're going to just give those extra 8 minutes to Tyus Jones because there's not anyone else on the Grizzlies that's a non-point guard that can take the responsibility there for those 8 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I guess Pop is just more strict. Like I said, he's got the 9-man, unless it's a blowout, then it goes, maybe 10, 12 people deep. It just depends on if it's a blowout or not. He's really strict with it. Now something I really wanted to know is, are you more confident in the Spurs being able to stop Ja Morant from getting his points? Or are you more confident in the Grizzlies stopping DeMar DeRozan from getting to his spots and getting his looks?
That's a good question. Because here's the thing with Ja. I think that a lot of the stuff with Ja, it's not necessarily an opponent stopping him. It's himself stopping himself. He's a pass first guy. He will always say, he says, I am a point guard, which means he's going to get his teammates in the right position. I remember a couple months ago, he had a game where they won by like 4. It was Houston. Like, it's no juggernaut or anything. They're playing the worst team in the league, but he had 5 and 7. And so somebody brought up, was like, aren't you not concerned about your stats? He goes, look at my plus minus. We won the game. Like he doesn't care about stats. We had a local former writer of GBB who now owns Patreon, Matt Herlicka. He had kind of compared his mentality to Jimmy Butler in a sense, where he's not going to care about his stats. He's going to focus on winning the game. And we've seen that he turns it on and turns on the Jets. After proclaiming himself as a top 5 point guard, he dropped 38 and 10 against Minnesota. But also we saw in the opening night game against San Antonio, he had 44 points and 9 assists. So I think with Ja Morant, it's just going to be, at what level is he turning it up to? Is he turning it up to kind of like that 5 or so that we see sometimes? Or is he going to go all gas, no brakes? He's going to show that he's the best player on the floor. With DeRozan, I'm going to put it, if I had to rank it on a scale of like 1 to 10, I'm going to say 5, because we've seen 2 different ends of the spectrum with DeMar DeRozan. The season opener game that y'all won, he had 27, 9, and 9. And just, he got to a spots wherever he wanted. He got to the free throw line 15 times. He just got wherever he wanted. But Dillon Brooks has been tasked as being the defensive stopper, and he's even getting all defense consideration too. And the other side of the spectrum, where we've seen Dillon Brooks just lock in and shut down DeRozan, in the January 30th game, he held DeRozan to only 6 shots, like 6 total shots. And when you're doing that, you're gonna force the Spurs into a tough hand as how to win a game. I think there's some middle ground there. Brooks has done a phenomenal job all year long. Noah, you follow me on Twitter. I'm the president of Dillon Brooks Island. But this season, here's some of his matchup data numbers. Dame went 9 for 24 against him. Luka went 5 for 20 against him. Bradley Beal went 4 of 15. Giannis went 4 of 11. SGA went 4 of 10. Steph Curry the other night. ESPN said 4 of 14 with Dillon Brooks as the final defender, but the NBA tracking data has it at 4 of 10. So he's shown that not only can he bother an opponent an entire night as just an agitator, but he can legitimately lock them down to take them out of their game completely. So it's just going to come down to basically how well can he stop him, because we've seen both sides of the park here.
Yeah, no, and you know what? I really am impressed by Dillon Brooks. Like I tuned in for that last game because obviously I wanted to know who the Spurs are playing in the first round of the play-in, and I thought a lot of the fouls that he picked up on Curry were they fouls? Like I didn't really believe that they were fouls, just kind of a product of what basketball has sort of become recently. But I was super impressed with what he did. I mean, even if 4 of 10, 4 of 14, whatever, ESPN says versus the NBA says, it was impressive. Like he did a really, really good job on Curry. And I think him fouling out was one of the main reasons Curry went off at the end of the game. And I'm interested to see how he plays DeRozan, because I think, like you said, if you can shut down DeRozan, there's not a lot of other guys on the Spurs roster who kind of get their own. Rudy Gay kind of gets his own, but he's very, very inconsistent. He had the worst shooting season of his, or second worst shooting season of his career. DeJounte's kind of like a 15, 8-8 guy at his peak. I don't really know that you're that worried about him. Now, let me ask you this. Is there anyone else in the Spurs lineup or roster who worries you at all as a guy who, oh man, this guy could go off?
Yeah, and honestly, after I answer this out, I would like to hear your thoughts on those two questions about Ja and DeRozan and then which player on the Grizzlies roster scares you the most. I'm going to say Patty Mills
Okay.
because he's just always gone off against the Grizzlies. It feels like he makes every shot. In his career against Memphis, he shoots 45% from three. So it just seems like he's just a guy that has the Grizzlies. Granted, it looks like he averaged about 9.5 points a game, but I think that's just that law of averages. There's probably been like the 2-point games, but there's also been the 20-point games. He just scares me because, I mean, I saw with the Grizzlies bench the other night of allowing Jordan Poole to go off. 2 games before that, Justin James for the
I
Sacramento
saw that.
Kings had 31 points. So if that bench defense is not on its A game and they let a guy like Patty Mills just destroy them, that's going to change the entire game.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I said it a little bit earlier, but Patty has been in like a career low slump. He's had 3 games over 50% shooting since the All-Star break. He's shooting about like 33.5%, 33% from the field, like 29% from 3 since the beginning of April. It hasn't looked good for him. He's looked really tired, and he's only had 1 day off recently. And even after that day off, I'm not sure that's going to be enough for him to come into this one playing game and really turn it around. Now he could in theory turn it around, maybe that day off plus, this days of rest between the play. And now his legs are under him a little bit. But I don't have a lot of confidence in him right now. But as far as, who I'm worried about on the Grizzlies, I would honestly say Dillon Brooks a little bit. Dillon Brooks or Jonas Valanciunas. We've seen Jakob Poeltl is really good at defending the rim, but he's not a great individual defender against some of the better big men. And I think Jonas Valanciunas is incredibly underrated around the league. He's a guy who can, he can drop 25-20 and you didn't even notice it. So I think he's definitely a threat to the Spurs because they don't have a lot of size. They play a small ball lineup where Jakob is their only big. And then off the bench, you got Drew Eubanks, who tends to get in foul trouble. Gorgie Jang, who has been dealing with a shoulder injury since he got here. He's a guy who worries me. And then Dillon Brooks, the Spurs have been one of the worst perimeter defenses in the NBA. So he's a guy who, to me, you let him, knock down a few shots, maybe he gets hot and then it's over. So those are the 2 guys who worry me the most on the Grizzlies.
Yeah, it's really funny because Draymond had his little rant. It's like, oh, center's been trying to do this to us all the time. We're like, yeah, Jonas had 29 and 16 and he only missed 4 shots total. So yeah, great job locking him down. You won that game because of Steph Curry and Andrew Wiggins and Jordan Poole. But I mean, I will say on a different note, Draymond is probably doing his best passing I've ever seen in his career. It was so on point in that game the other night. The Warriors, if it's the Warriors versus either one of our teams, I'm scared to play one of those teams in a play-in. I don't want to have single elimination against Steph or Draymond.
No, I don't either. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But yeah, I mean, that's something I would not want to see. I think I'd honestly rather face the Lakers than the Warriors. And that's not because I'm not afraid of like a LeBron or AD, but I think they're kind of stumbling into the playoffs, not 100% healthy, whereas the Warriors look pretty good recently. And they've got Steph, they've got Draymond. So, and they've got guys like Jordan Poole and Andrew Wiggins who are contributing in other ways better than what I thought that they would this season. Now, I kind of want to move on and talk about Taylor Jenkins, Blake Ahern. They spend a ton of time on the Austin Spurs staff. And Kyle Anderson has started his career with the Spurs. Do you think their experience and their like kind of corporate knowledge, if you will, about the Spurs system and how San Antonio runs things will provide any sort of advantage for the Grizzlies? And if so, what sort of advantage do you think that creates for them?
I think it's nice. You can kind of see a lot of Spursy elements into Taylor Jenkins' system. Even Charles Barkley on TNT, I want to say it was the Martin Luther King Jr. game the Grizzlies were playing in. He even said that the Grizzlies have become very Spurs-like and how they run their offense, just the amount of depth they have and all that stuff. I think any advantage that they have of familiarity it's just kind of zeroed out because of the familiarity that Popovich has on his end, just because Taylor Jenkins is of the Budenholzer coaching tree, which is from the Popovich coaching tree. He has those same elements. He knows Kyle's spots. Granted, Kyle Anderson has rejuvenated his game and has now added an outside shot. I think he almost quadrupled his career high in 3-pointers made, while also increasing his percentage. So he's been awesome. But I just think it kind of zeroes out. I mean, Coach Popovich is so great. I was talking about it on our podcast the other night or last night. Popovich took this roster that, let's be real. No, I don't want to upset you. They shouldn't be here. They should not be. Like, DeRozan's awesome. DeRozan is at the top of my free agent targets for the Grizzlies in the offseason. But like, Popovich is awesome. I don't like, just like how I don't want to play Steph Curry in a play-in in a single elimination. Granted, I'm not scared about the product on the court. I'm more worried about Coach Popovich in a single elimination game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I asked, I guess editor-in-chief of Grizzly Bear Blues, Joe, earlier, the same question. And he was just saying to me, and I thought was sort of interesting, is at the very least, the advantage it would provide is that he knows not to underestimate the Spurs, right? And Coach Popovich and what they're able to do, because I do agree with you. I don't take any offense to that. Like, this Spurs roster, I didn't think they were very good. I had them ranked 4th in this division before the season began, before the Harden trade and everything. Granted, things have changed since then, but it's just not that great of a roster. If they were healthy, maybe I would say, they should be a little bit better than they were this season. But even then, I had them pegged for like the 9-10 spot in the play-in. So they pretty much have lived up exactly to my expectations. DeRozan is good, but he's not the engine of a championship offense. DeJounte's really good, but I think he wouldn't have this sort of responsibility on a normal playoff team. And then as far as the rest of the guys, great. They're great. I like them. I like Keldon Johnson for what he is. I like Jakob Poeltl for what he is. I like Lonnie for what he is, but none of those guys are like a star caliber player. The bench to me is not very good. So I think Popovich has done a pretty good job with this roster. Now, in terms of like the offense, I think a lot of people have criticized him, said, well, they've got to shoot more threes. Well, they don't really have the personnel to do that. You don't just shoot threes just to shoot more threes. I've heard people say, well, why are Patty out there? Why is Rudy out there so much when they're negative defenders and they're not that efficient this year? Well, I mean, I think we always kind of knew that Pop trusts his vets, and it's not like Luka Šamanić or Kendary Weatherspoon or Trey Jones were going to, steal their spots in the rotation. Luka Šamanić has hardly found a spot on the court in his first 2 years in San Antonio. So I'm a little nervous for this matchup with the Grizzlies, because I think that they're more talented than the Spurs are at this point. Now, something else I wanted to ask you about this team is, we talked about it a little bit earlier, Jaren Jackson. To me, he would look like a guy who's going to potentially be a breakout star of the bubble. He looked so good in the bubble before he went down. I want to know, why was his recovery process so long? I didn't think that like a torn meniscus took that long to recover. So I don't know if you can kind of enlighten me about that. But then I also want to know, what do you think of his play since he's come back? Has he looked good? Has he looked rusty? Is he someone who you're confident in going into this game?
Yeah, I'll get into the recovery process first. And I agree. I had Jaren Jackson Jr. as a breakout star of the bubble. In fact, I had just pitched a piece to write about how Jaren Jackson Jr. was going to be the breakout star of the bubble. And then as I started writing it, I got the Woj bomb.
Man.
So it was so tough. I mean, I spun it, and how it kind of showed that he could be that guy. But with his recovery process, GM Zach Kleiman, he spoke to the media several months ago prior to his return. And so they did a different surgery. So most of the meniscus surgeries, I don't know the whole medical terms, but they did more of a removal of the damage in there, where they did a full repair of the meniscus, which is supposed to have like a 6-month, 8-month recovery, which was about online. But with this team, with what he was trying to do, they wanted to ensure that Jaren Jackson Jr. was back at 110%. They had different benchmarks that they had him complete before. So was it a long process? Yeah. But I would take that over these little constant nagging injuries that we're seeing in our own division with Kristaps Porzingis right now. A similar player that had a similar injury. I'm fine with what they did. It's been fine. And with Jaren, it's just more of a mixed bag. They're getting absolutely obliterated with him on the court. And I think that's just him getting back to game speed and shaking off rust more than anything. But this is kind of like a threshold that I set for Jaren Jackson Jr. It's one that I set for Justice Winslow as well, is for guys that were out for 7 to 9 months, having to rehab in the middle of a pandemic and use their offseason and training camp and preseason towards rehabbing, I'm going to just take the flashes, because you can mark up every kind of wrong that they're doing with rust and game speed and limited practice time. And they're not perfect players. They have flaws, but that's just kind of what I am marking up to as of this season. So I'm going to just take the mixed results with Jaren Jackson Jr. and take the flashes. He's been very good getting stock numbers. So he's getting a lot of steals, getting a lot of blocks. I'll take that, but just because of his constant activity just is kind of to a fault a little bit. He makes just some lapses and maybe overcommits or just draws silly fouls. And I tweeted this the other night. I think he does this a lot to himself. But I think at this point too, Jaren Jackson Jr. is developing the reputation of being a fouler to the point where there's sometimes where he's like, where the ref's like, well, he's near it. There's contact. It just had to be him. Like, I remember Brandon Clark was trying to say the foul was on him, and it looked like it was on Clark, but they called it on Jaren Jackson Jr. And it's just because of, and I think Dillon Brooks is a victim to this as well. You get reputation calls pretty much because you are a notorious fouler. So I'm just kind of taking the mixed bag there. I mean, he's grabbing more rebounds. Like, his rebounding rate has gone through the roof compared to what it was. That was always a big flaw. I'll take that. He's getting a lot more putbacks. He's still looking fluid with the ball in his hands, but there's some times where he just kind of loses control a little bit, whether it's with his footing or with his ball handling. His shot is slowly returning, but I think, into your last question about the impact, I'm going to chalk it up to what his foul situation is, because his problem isn't just the number of fouls he gets called on him. He picks them up in pairs. So if he picks up a first foul, you can bank on him getting a second one within the next minute. And that's what really takes him out of the game. That's what really disrupts his flow and everything. So I'm just going to chalk everything up to that.
Yeah, and I think that's fair, and I like the explanation you gave me, because I wasn't really sure why it took him so long to come back. Makes more sense now. But to your point of fouling, where people become sort of get a reputation for fouling, Jakob Poeltl, I think at times has been a victim of this, where he's a guy who comes in, you're like, that was a foul, but I mean, when he first started playing with San Antonio, he used to pick up fouls a lot, and it's kind of carried on with him. And that's something I am worried about. If you get him in foul trouble at any point, like if Ja's really aggressive attacking the rim and you somehow, you get Jakob in foul trouble early, I think that's going to be huge for the Grizzlies, in a good way. Not so good for the Spurs. So I want to watch for that as well, because I really don't have a lot of confidence in Drew Eubanks and Gorgui Dieng to kind of pick up the slack off the bench. Poeltl isn't someone who I think a lot of people care about or know about in the NBA, but he finished third in total blocks this season. He finished second in screen points and screen assists behind Rudy Gobert, and he also finished second in shots contested this season. So he's a guy who is really integral to the Spurs, who I don't think a lot of people outside of San Antonio really know much about or care much about. But if you can get that guy in foul trouble, I think the Spurs are in a lot of trouble themselves. Now, a guy who is really, his play has kind of been concerning to me, and maybe it shouldn't be concerning, but Ja Morant, the Grizzlies went, I think, 5-1 over their last 6 games. But I was looking at his numbers. Ja didn't really shoot that well. He didn't play that well. His turnovers were up a little bit. His assists were up as well. Are you concerned about him performing up to, I guess, his normal standards on Wednesday, or do you think he's going to come locked and loaded and ready to play?
I think he's going to turn it up. He has a really good sense of urgency to where he knows when he has to turn it up. I'm expecting him to. I mean, he's just he's a winner when it comes down to it. I mean, I think at the beginning of the show, I said Taylor Jenkins deserves a lot of credit, but at the end of the day, Ja Morant's the one running the show, and he's been keeping this ship rolling for the past 2 years. He's a primary reason why the rebuild is over after just a year and a half, pretty much. I think he'll perform up to his standards. Granted, I'm not gonna devalue what San Antonio has on their end defensively. DeJounte Murray's one hell of a defender. His size and his length is going to cause problems for whichever guy is guarding between Ja Morant or Dillon Brooks or even any of the bench guys. But I think Ja Morant would know to turn it up. He did that last year in the play-in as well against Portland. He had like 35-8 or something like that against Portland. I can't pull it up right now because Basketball Reference and NBA.com just acted like the play-in game never happened. There's no stats to back it up, but yeah, I think he'll perform up to his standards for sure.
Yeah, I'm excited to see him play regardless if the Spurs win or lose. He's one of my favorite guys to watch play, just the energy he brings to the court, his athleticism, his tenacity. I really love watching him play. But Memphis has a pretty good supporting cast. We talked about it a little bit. Jonas Valanciunas, Dillon Brooks, Kyle Anderson, Brandon Clark, Desmond Bane, Xavier Tillman, all those guys, really solid, bench units, supporting cast in the starting unit. Is there any guy who you're seeing as sort of like an X factor out of those guys for you, for not for you, but for the Memphis Grizzlies when they play San Antonio on Wednesday, where if this guy goes off, then you think, I am confident that the Grizzlies win this game?
I'm going to go with somebody you did not mention. That's DeAnthony Melton.
Okay. Yeah, I love
a
him
lot
too.
of the time. Yeah, he's awesome. A lot of the time this year, he looks like the third, fourth best guy. I've said before, I think he has the most upside of any prospect that's not named Ja Morant or Jaren Jackson Jr. I'm pulling something up right now. He's been in a massive slump over the past 16, 17 games. So in the first 35 games of the season, he shot 46% from three. And in his last 16, it's down to 29%. And it goes with his field goal percentage as well. He's gone from 48% to 31%. So if they can get the guy that we've seen all season long, the guy who's a on-off god for a bench guy, I think his on-off is it tanked down. But last year it was like a 10-point differential with him on the floor. If he could be that difference maker off the bench and he can get his shot going from deep and just really just tune into that ball handling and his on-ball dribble or all-ball creation in the mid-range or as a passer that we saw in the beginning of the season, I like the Grizzlies' chances of coming out with the win. But I'm going to flip this back to you with San Antonio. It's really DeRozan and whoever's on that night for San Antonio. So who would you say is that big X factor for San Antonio?
I think the X factor for San Antonio, maybe this is a little bit of a cop-out. I'm going to throw two of them out there. For one, DeJounte has to show up. There's been games where he's had, 25, 26 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists, and he's looked like, a potential all-star. And then there's nights where he goes out there and it's 7, 4, and 4, and he played 30 minutes. If he does the latter, San Antonio has no chance to win. They're going to need him to show up. Another guy who I wanted to bring up was Lonnie Walker. He's another guy, very, very inconsistent. He had 31 against the Bucks. Then he got injured. He came back, went through the whole rehab process. And there was a stretch of 3 games against the Utah Jazz, who were very good. And then against the Sixers, where he scored 4 points in total over 80 minutes. If he does that, I don't think they have a chance because he is the starter now. With no Derek White, he is the starting shooting guard. So if we get the Lonnie that can provide, 18 points or so off the bench, great. But if they don't get that from him, if he's a guy who kind of disappears, doesn't really show up for this game, I don't think they have a chance because really I don't see anybody else outside of Patty Mills as being sort of a spark plug because most of these guys are they're not shoot first. They're not looking to score the ball. Of course, everyone's trying to score the ball in the game, but they're not guys who you can say, go get me a few points. They're really guys who kind of work within the flow of the offense. Like a Jakob doesn't average 10 points per game. Keldon averages about 12 points per game, but he's not someone who I think anyone game plans around. He gets points because other guys get him in good positions. Whereas Lonnie, I think, has a little bit of self-creation ability. So those two guys, if they can get engaged, if they can play well, I think the Spurs have a good chance, at least in this first round in the play-in. But If they don't show up, I don't think the Spurs have any chance to win this game. And that's really been the case for most of the season. Now, Vegas had the Grizzlies favored to win. I can't really say that I disagree with that. Do you believe that the Grizzlies are going to win? And maybe by how much? Do you think it's going to be a blowout, or you think this is going to be a close one?
You're trapping me here because this is just, I'm going to end up jinxing myself. I'm going to say it's going to be a very competitive game, and I would not be surprised by either outcome.
That's fair. That's 100% fair.
I don't want to jinx anything. Not at all.
No, I really do. I think it's going to be a really close matchup between two teams who are like pretty fairly evenly matched up. I'll pull up the stats real quick. I think they're both like relatively low volume 3-point shooters. They both shoot about 35% for the season. They're both pretty good at rebounding. They move the ball well. They hardly turn the ball over at all, which is a huge hallmark of a Gregg Popovich team. You can see that's kind of rubbed off on Taylor Jenkins and how he, I guess, coaches the guys out there to take care of the ball. I just think it's whoever capitalizes on the most mistakes by the other team is probably going to be the team that ends up winning this game, which is the case for most games, but especially for teams that really don't commit hardly any turnovers and really don't foul that much. Now, one of the last things I did want to ask you when it comes to this game in particular is, if Memphis does move on, would you rather face the Lakers or the Warriors in the second round of the play-in, and why?
I want to go with the Warriors because, well, let's just chalk it up with this. LeBron James isn't on the other side for the Warriors, but I mean, they also have Steph Curry. But the Lakers have the number one defense in the league, and I just do not want to play LeBron James in a single elimination game, especially when, let's be real, if LeBron never got hurt, if AD never got hurt, they're at the top of the West. They're a team that is in the play-in because they had some of the worst injury luck, especially having to lose LeBron James and Anthony Davis at the same time. Like that. Yeah. We had a lot of national TV games with too much Schroeder, too much Kuzma, too much Andre Drummond. But I think the Warriors is a little more manageable because, I mean, we saw what Dylan Brooks can do when he's not in foul trouble against Steph Curry. He can lock him up and bother him. For some reason, all season long, the Grizzlies have just been destroyed by Jordan Poole and Andrew Wiggins. It's really just been insane. Wiggins had a game in Memphis in March where he had like 38, 40 points, something like that. He's averaging 27 and 9 against Memphis this season. And Jordan Poole, I think my co-host of the Core 4 podcast, Nathan Chester, put basically just a curse where Jordan Poole is going to go off against Memphis because he called him the worst player in the league. And he's actually been awesome since he came back from the G League bubble. Our G League guy, Brandon Abraham, was really just he was telling me, he's like, this Jordan Poole guy is going to be pretty good. Like, he's going to be pretty good when he comes back up. And he's right. Yeah, Jordan Poole is averaging 22 points a game against Memphis. So it's tough. I don't want to face either team in a single elimination game, but when it comes down to which game do I see them winning, it's the Warriors.
Yeah. I said earlier, I think I would rather face the Lakers. And I think that's just because, they have been so banged up. I wouldn't really want the Spurs to face either of these teams if I had to pick, because you're right. It is really tough. I mean, when I'm thinking of what the Spurs did this year, they were able to beat the healthy Lakers minus Derek White. They split them 1-1 early on in the season. And then with the Warriors, 2 of the games were blowouts in favor of the Warriors. So I just think the Warriors have the Spurs number. They don't really have anybody who can guard Steph Curry. DeJounte's a fantastic defender, but if you don't have somebody like a Derek White, which they don't, to sort of help, he's going to get loose somehow. He's going to get his shot. So for that reason, I think the Spurs would probably lose either way, but I think I'd rather them face the Lakers, albeit I don't think they're going to win that game. So as we kind of come to a close here, do you have any other thoughts on this matchup, on the Spurs, on the Grizzlies? Just shoot for it.
No, sure. I'm excited about this matchup, and I appreciate you having me on to talk about it. One thing I'll ask you is just from an outside observer of a former Spur, Kyle Anderson. Just give me some quick thoughts on what you think of his, I guess, renaissance this year. I mean, I know like some national writers that have him as that third guy behind Julius Randle and Jeremy Grant on most improved ballots. What do you think of the progression of Kyle Anderson and just how he really just evolved his game to stick around?
He's been absolutely fantastic. I mean, since he came out of UCLA, I think what Spurs fans hope for is exactly what Memphis is getting now. And I'm not saying he wasn't a good player in San Antonio. He was really good. I thought that they should have spent money on him rather than Davis Bertans, who they ended up letting go. But I think it's pretty fantastic what he's been able to do. He can distribute the ball. He's still, to me, plays all NBA level defense. Despite his limited mobility, his limited athleticism, he uses every inch of that length. He's got fantastic footwork. And the fact that he's been able to add a three ball is huge. That is huge because obviously we don't know which players and how often they get to work with a guy like Chip England, who's sort of like a legendary shooting coach in the NBA. But it seemed like if Chip England couldn't do it in San Antonio, then there wouldn't be a lot of hope for him to develop that once he left. And he's left San Antonio, and what do you know? He can shoot the three now. So I'm really happy for Kyle Anderson. I think he's really valuable. I'd love to see him back in silver and black one day. I think the chances of that are very, very low. Very, very low. But I'm really happy for him. I think he's been really good for Memphis. And I don't know about top three. Maybe there's an argument for top three and most improved player, but to me, he's definitely like top five guy in that category because he really has improved his game across the board. And I think for me, and maybe you can correct me because you cover the Grizzlies, but it kind of started in last year's bubble where he was starting to shoot the three more. He looked more confident. He was letting it fly. So I'm kind of excited to see him play too, because I like a lot of the former Spurs. I always like to continue supporting them even after they've left San Antonio.
For sure. Well, maybe he can end up back in black and silver when they negotiate a sign and trade where DeRozan comes to Memphis. How about that?
I think that would be fine. I think a lot of Spurs fans are, and I'm not saying I'm part of that group, but there are a lot of Spurs fans who are ready to move on from DeRozan and sort of start a rebuild because right now the Spurs are sort of in flux. They're not bad enough to tank. They're not good enough to compete for a title, and that's not a great area to be in.
Yeah, for Memphis, it's one of those things where next year it's time to start be outside of the play-in, start pushing for that top six, start pushing for home court, and really just get the rebuild going because you want to spend money before you have to spend money on John Jaren because you won't have that luxury anymore. And they just very much need a veteran who can contribute towards quality rotation or even starter minutes. The Grizzlies can open up $25 million in cap room if they opt out of the Winslow team option and then waive the non-guaranteed contract of Jonte Porter, who's the 15th, 16th guy. I mean, he's got pushed behind Killian Tilly, who's a two-way guy. So, and I always say, don't opt out of that Winslow team option unless you know you can make a move that can raise your ceiling next season. And DeRozan just checks all the boxes for me, and I think it's attainable. It's not a pipe dream. I mean, especially if you gave him all that cap space. Almost everybody on the Grizzlies is under contract next season except for Winslow because of that team option. So if you opt out of that and you give him all that cap space for maybe 2 years, I think it can work. It just comes down to what DeRozan wants to do as far as take less money, go to a contender, or still be that guy towards a rising team with a guy like Ja Morant.
Now, let me ask you this. I was going to let you go, but I want to ask you one more question then. So with DeRozan, what I know you said he checks all the boxes. What exactly would you be expecting of DeRozan entering Memphis if he was to sign with Memphis? And what do you like about him so much?
The simple of the Grizzlies just need a veteran leader and a veteran on the wing where if they're in an offensive slump and they need a bucket, they have a guy that can count on. They have a guy they can lean on in clutch situations. I think I read something where aside from Beal, it's either Damon Beal or Damon Steph that DeRozan leads the league in clutch points. And he's well respected across the league. Young guys love him. And I think he's just a perfect complement next to Ja Morant. I think he really just he would be embraced here because of just how he's kind of a legend. Like he's been so great for over a decade now. And I think he's the guy that he may not be the guy that gets the Grizzlies the title. He may not be there when it's time to win championships or potentially in that parade, but he's a guy that can be on the journey to help them get there. And that's kind of like what it checks for me is they just need a winner on the wing. And more importantly, not just a guy who's just a good locker room guy to handle the politics and be a median between the coaching staff and the front office and the players. They need a guy that's a veteran that's been there before. He's already has his scars, and he can help his team get where they need to go.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're wrong about that at all. I think DeMar has kind of provided that, even though the Spurs are almost on the brink of missing the playoffs for 2 straight seasons. I don't really think that's all on DeMar. I know a lot of fans want to say, oh, well, he doesn't play defense. That's fair. He's not a great defender, but I think what he does bring every single night is you can count on him to bring at least 20 points per night, at least 5 rebounds per night. He's an excellent leader. He's an excellent locker room guy. The young guys here talk about him. They rave about him all the time. And most of all, I think he's a really underrated distributor at this point in his career. Like, he finished 11th in the NBA in assists per game, which is something I don't know if you had brought him in at the very beginning of his career. Many people would have pegged him for that. He's really developed the ability to distribute, and he turns the ball over just about 2 times a game, which is incredible. That's like a 3.5 to 1 assist to turnover ratio. So I think that there's a lot of good that you would get out of DeRozan. So I would be a little sad to see him leave, but I also think the Spurs, it's time for them to figure out what they're doing, because clearly this roster isn't it. But I do want to thank you for joining me. Before I let you go, where can people find your writing, your podcast? If you want to shout out anything, just go for it.
Yeah, for sure. You can find all my written content over at grizzlybearblues.com. It is the SB Nation affiliate for the Memphis Grizzlies. And you can follow our podcast network on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Megaphone, anywhere you get your podcast. On the Grizzly Bear Blues podcast network, we have a show called The Starting Five with just 5 great hosts that just have this chemistry and really make the 5 host podcast work and flowing. You feel like you're in the room. We have the 3&D podcast as well that kind of gets more into like game style and team fit. But also too, they get into like some of the betting stuff, the sports gambling stuff and betting lines, stuff like that. You have the Core 4 podcast, which is a podcast I host with my co-host Nathan Chester. That's where we kind of take 4 different things going on through that week and in the long view and go over those. And then we have GBB Live, or that's Joe Molinax and I. That's our site manager. We just have guests of varieties. I mean, we've had players like D'Anthony Melton and Avery Bradley on our show. We've had it's blanking on me which guests that we've had, but we've had local, national, other SB Nation sites. Sometimes y'all get lucky and get us too, but yeah, it was fun. So Noah, just do whatever you do to close out the show.
Well, again, thanks so much for joining me, Parker. I had a blast talking Spurs and Grizzlies basketball with you. For those of you watching at home, make sure to check out everything they're doing over at Grizzly Bear Blues. As always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification button if you want to know when new videos are dropping. But until next time, Spurs fans, take care.